The representation of marginalized communities have been historically discriminative to anyone who is not a white, cisgender, heterosexual man. Racism, homophobia, and sexism, along with other forms of discrimination, have managed to plague contemporary media by depicting harmful stereotypes of people of color, women, and LGBTQ folks, all the while ignoring the intersections of these people's identities, which are not portrayed on screen.
You may not be aware of the lack of representation because it does not directly affect you. The reality is that the whiteness in the media perpetuates and upholds the racist institutions by normalizing whiteness and pushing others towards the margins.
Despite the grip that white supremacy has on different platforms of media, there are still people who are trying to combat this lack of representation.
The whole idea of a stereotype is to simplify. Chinua Achebe. How did we get here? The first people of color on media technically weren't people of color, but people pretending to be a color. It all started in the 1830s when Thomas Dartmouth Rice became known as the father of minstrelsy and developed the ever so popular Jim Crow. He would come in and stereotype the actions and tendencies of those of black people. He would depict them as lazy, ignorant, superstitious, hypersexual, and that of being thieves. How far have we really come from the 1830s? Because fast forward and we're still talking about the same thing in today's society. As messed up as it is, only little has changed. Prominent American actors such as Shirley Temple, Judy Garland, and Mickey Rooney, to name a few, have what in common? Other than winning awards is that they were all guilty of donning the black-faced character themselves. Let's move forward to 1939. Does the name Ethel Waters ring a bell? Ethel Waters was the first black person on television, which is a great milestone, but for her to be recognized, she had to play a maid. A maid who sang, which is still the stereotype being portrayed on television to this day. Let's move forward to the 1950s with Pedro Gonzalez. Pedro Gonzalez was the guest on the quiz show You Bet Your Life, and the punchline was his deep Spanish accent. The deep Spanish accent would be entertaining to the normal white American, which is still the stereotype being portrayed on television to this day. I mean, hell, even our kids' cartoons back in the day would exploit the individualistic fallacy, that of a Hispanic male. While we all know and love Speedy Gonzalez, we forget about his gun-carrying gangster best friend, Slowpoke Rodriguez. Let's move to the 1970s, where Pat Morita, who played Arnold Takahashi, who was the fun-loving Asian owner of Arnold's Drive-In on Happy Days, spoke every Asian language. He too had his own show for a brief time, which mainly focused on that Asian stereotype. Is there progress?
The accessibility of television and social media has allowed for the consumption of entertainment at rapid speeds. At times, that information is direct. Other times, we may not consider what we are watching as influential. Nonetheless, studies have shown that the media has an impact on public opinion. In a study conducted from 1987 to 2009 that examined the connection with consistency and quality of marginalized groups on television and white folks' corresponding attitudes towards those groups, showed how uncommon people of color were represented on primetime television. The study considered the population of actors as those who had recurring roles. The numbers never surpassed 22% for any minority group. The Latinx community, who are the largest ethnic minority group in the United States, as of 2009, had not surpassed 4% of that population. Other ethnicities hardly have any representation at all. Overall, the study did not find a change in the attitudes of white Americans and the percentage of ethnic population in primetime television, but that doesn't mean there isn't a public opinion. The ethnic minority characters that do make it on screen as part of a recurring cast tend to be presented as highly positive. It is ironic because it has been criticized for promoting the post-racial ideology and color blindness. It is viewed as tokenistic and a privilege to those actors who are willing to be appealing to whiteness. Some are exalted for having diverse casts, but obscure the inequalities of reality by not accurately portraying the racism that characters would actually face. Black Americans are overly featured in sitcoms and crime dramas where negative stereotypes are still very prominent. Reality crime shows play a bigger role in perceptions of black crime. Latinos are also victim to these perceptions. research still shows that news outlets tie Black and Latino Americans to crime and poverty. People who say they watch the news more frequently are less likely to believe the lack of success of African Americans and Latin Americans have to do with lack of job opportunity and more on lack of motivation.
LGBTQ folks, women, and other marginalized groups have been excluded from mainstream media, and while we are currently seeing more people from these marginalized groups on screen, they are still underrepresented, misrepresented, and often whitewashed out of media. The underrepresentation of these marginalized groups is still an issue despite how much screen time these groups have been able to accumulate as time has progressed. Disabled people make up 12.8% of the US population, but only account for 1.7% of media representation. Queer folks make up 3.8% of the US pop and account for only 4.8% of media. Women account for 44%, which is still low, as they make up 51% of the population. And people of color make up about 41% of the population, but only hold between 21 and 34% of media outlets. Media lacks intersectionality. It portrays characters that represent minority groups as flat and lacking multidimensional identities and stories. Most of the disabled folks depicted are white males, excluding people of color, women, and LGBTQ disabled folks. LGBTQ folks that are portrayed are played by a majority of white gay men, excluding queer women and transgender folks. Women are also underrepresented, and it's worse for women of color. There is a test called the Bechdel test, which is used to see if a film is inclusive of women and is composed of 3 criteria. 1. It has to have at least 2 women who 2. Talk to each other about 3. Something besides a man. You'd be surprised as to how many of your favorite films do not pass this test. When dissecting misrepresentation and how these groups are depicted to mainstream American society, people of color often fall victim to tropes, which are common overused roles, often stereotypical, imposed onto specific groups based on widely believed assumptions. These tropes are harmful as they perpetuate the discrimination and mockery of people of color. However, these are just about the only roles available for POC to play. For Latinx men, it's the Latin lover, and for Latinas, it's the spicy Latina. Both are exotified, sexualized depictions of Latinx people. This role often includes a thick accent and a light-skinned actor, reducing the women to objects for male consumption, and depicting Latinx men as sex-crazed macho men. Then we have the trope of the help, so gardeners, maids, cooks, etc. They are often played by darker-skinned Latinx people. Black folks have the angry black man and the sassy black woman, depicting the black man as aggressive and dangerous, while the black woman is reduced to a joke and only there to entertain the audience through her quirky phrases and antics, ignoring the fact that black women are multifaceted just as everybody else. We desperately need more characters that are multifaceted and well-rounded. The media needs to stop feeding people toxic stereotypes that perpetuate the discrimination of minority groups. We need more producers, directors, and writers that work from the margins. It makes all the difference having a person from said minority group at the table to ensure that their group is being accurately represented and not being reduced to harmful stereotypes. We still need more access to shows that represent us, our stories, and our identities.
Critical Media Project is a free website that has resources for educators between the ages of 18 to 21 and want to make a difference in the world. They have 2 missions that they want to accomplish. The first is to raise critical awareness and provide the tools to decode media representations of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, socio-economic class, religion, age, and disability, and develop an understanding as to how these identities intersect. The other is to encourage and offer guidance for students to tell their own stories, create their own representations, and uphold their status as active and engaged participants in civic society.